In this video, we will work with absolute positioning. Just like relative positioning, when an element has absolute positioning, it will take it out of the normal flow. However, it will no longer affect the position of other elements. Then there's this next portion. It will position it in relation to its first, that should be first, sorry about that. It will be in relation to its first position ancestor container. Now, what do I mean by ancestor? Well, if you recall from a previous video earlier in this class, whenever we have an element nested within another element, then you can think of the container element as the parent. For example, this H2 right here, its parent is this article because it's inside it or nested inside it. And then this article is nested inside section. So you can think of this section as an ancestor to this H2. And then this section is nested within main. So you can think of main as an ancestor to H2. And then finally, main is contained within body. So you can think of body as an ancestor to H2. Now, it's not just about being an ancestor, it has to be positioned. To be a positioned ancestor means that you have set a positioning scheme other than static. So this ancestor can have relative positioning, absolute positioning, or fixed positioning. Now, if there is no position ancestor, then it will be relative to the body container or your browser window. So let's see what all that means. Let's start a new section in our HTML. And inside this section, we'll put in an article. And inside that article, we'll start with the H2. And it will say absolute positioning. For the first paragraph, let's talk a little more about absolute positioning. An element with, quote, position absolute, quote, enables you to set the exact position of HTML content on a page, setting the top, bottom, left, and right properties of an absolutely positioned element will cause it to be adjusted from its normal flow. That's this first portion here. Takes it out of the normal flow in relation to its first positioned ancestor. So when you set something to have absolute positioning, your web browser will look through that element's ancestors and look for the first one, the first position ancestor. And if it can't find one, then it will go with the body in relation to the body or the browser window. This means that this ancestor needs to have some kind of positioning scheme other than static. If there is no positioned ancestor, then it will be positioned in relation to the browser window, which is essentially the same thing as body. Other content will adjust to fill any gap left by the element with absolute positioning. it will no longer affect the position of other elements. Second paragraph. This second paragraph will be the one that will eventually have absolute positioning. This is the second paragraph in the absolute positioning section. Finally, for the third paragraph, we'll just say, and this is not true yet, but it will be once we set the second paragraph to have absolute positioning. But we'll go ahead and say this for now. The second paragraph in this section has absolute positioning. Okay, let's save that and check out our preview. Right now, everything within the absolute positioning section has normal or static positioning. Everything is flowing as expected. Now let's go ahead and set up the second paragraph to have absolute positioning. We'll give it a class of position2. In CSS, we'll create that position2 class selector. And we'll say position absolute. We'll do that for now. Now, take a look before I refresh. Let me save my HTML CSS. Now, before I refresh, check out where the second paragraph is and check out where the third paragraph is. When I refresh, the second paragraph that has absolute positioning is no longer part of the normal flow. The third paragraph pushed itself up. If you look at the inspector here, right click and then inspect, when you hover over that absolute positioning section, you'll notice that the second paragraph with absolute positioning is no longer part of that. Since it decided to have absolute positioning, all the other elements were like, well, you're this absolute element now, so we're not going to consider you part of the group now. You will no longer affect our position. So they will act like it's not even there. And right now, we have not set the top, bottom, left, or right properties. So it's just kind of sitting outside of this section. So let's change that. Let's add a top property. Let's make it 8 pixels on the top. Save that and refresh. And now you'll find that depending on your browser window size, that it may end up in the header section. Now, if I resize my browser window, okay, well, oh, it's because I haven't done a left property yet. All right, so scratch that thought for now. Let's go back to the 8 pixels. Now it's 8 pixels from the top. And the reason for that is it looked at its first ancestor article and said, no positioning scheme there other than static. This one is not positioned. Main is not positioned. So it positioned itself in relation to the browser window, 8 pixels from the top. So now when I do left, and we'll say 250 px, 250 pixels from the left. All right, now, depending on your browser window, it might be in the header section or it might not be in the header section. But one thing that it will always be is it will always be 8 pixels from the top and 250 pixels from the left. It is absolutely positioned at that spot based on the browser window. So let's see what happens when there is a position ancestor. Let's go back to the HTML, look through its ancestors and choose one. We'll say the section. Now this section starts right there. If you hover over this using inspect, you'll see that section is right there. So it starts right there. We will make this section have some kind of positioning scheme other than static. We'll call this Gramps, since it's the grandfather to this position, or to this element right here. Save your HTML. I'll go to my CSS, Gramps. We'll say position relative, save, and refresh. Now, this paragraph with absolute positioning has a position ancestor, which is section. So now it will be relative to where this first position ancestor is. And this article or a section starts right there. So 8 pixels from the top and 250 pixels from the left. And this one, since section is always within main, it will always be 8 pixels from the top, 250 pixels from the left, in relation to where this particular absolute, or to where this section is. And that is how absolute positioning works. In the next video, we will do fixed positioning.